It had been a long, dry summer in the small town where the rancher lived. The sun had scorched the fields for weeks, leaving the earth cracked and thirsty. Crops that were supposed to feed families had withered away, and the livestock grew thinner by the day. The rancher, a man in his late 30s named Jacob, had always believed he could survive anything the land threw at him. But this season felt different. Each morning, he would wake before the sun, put on his worn boots, and step out into the silent fields. The air was heavy, almost lifeless, and the once vibrant colors of the ranch seemed drained. Jacob felt the weight of years pressing down on him, a mixture of exhaustion, worry, and a loneliness he could not shake. Jacob had inherited the ranch from his father, who had taught him everything about farming, caring for animals, and the delicate balance of nature. But the world had changed since those days. Small ranches were harder to maintain, and the banks were less forgiving. Jacob had tried everything he could think of, selling produce, cutting costs, borrowing from neighbors, but the debt only grew. His savings had long run out, and the foreclosure notices were beginning to arrive. Every letter felt like a punch to the gut, and the nights were spent staring at the ceiling. Unable to sleep, he loved his land. But now it seemed like a chain he could not break. The people in town noticed his struggles. Jacob was no stranger to gossip. Small towns rarely offered privacy. His neighbors whispered about him, shaking their heads when he passed by. "Poor Jacob," they said. "He's trying, but the land has won this time." The words were never spoken directly to him, but they weighed heavily, seeping into his thoughts. He could hear them even when no one was talking, and yet he refused to leave. This land had been in his family for generations, and he could not imagine turning his back on it. Even as he watched the crops dry up and the fences fall apart, he told himself he would find a way through. There had to be a way. Jacob's only company during these long days was his dog, Scout. The loyal black Labrador never left his side. Scout would trot alongside him through the dry fields, sniffing the earth, sometimes finding a patch of shade to rest while Jacob worked. In many ways, Scout was the only one who understood him. The rancher would talk to the dog as he worked, telling him about the day's plans, the small successes, and the fears that kept him awake at night. Scout listened without judgment, his tail wagging at the slightest encouragement. It was a small comfort, but in those moments, Jacob felt a flicker of hope that things might turn around. One afternoon, as Jacob walked along the perimeter of his land, checking fences that had been damaged by the heat and wind, he noticed something unusual. A group of people had gathered at the edge of town, talking in low, excited voices. Curiosity pulled him closer. From where he stood, he could see a tall figure moving gracefully among the crowd. She was different from anyone he had seen in the town before, not because of her clothes or her mannerisms, but because of her presence. She was tall, almost towering, and she carried herself with a quiet confidence. There was a softness in her movements, but also a strength that could not be ignored. The whispers around her spoke of her as if she were a legend. "The woman from the north. She's coming here to live." Jacob watched for a moment, intrigued but cautious. People like her rarely came to small towns like his. The next few days brought more rumors. She had arrived in town and rented a small house on the outskirts, near the hills. Some said she was looking for work. Others whispered that she had a past filled with struggles, much like his own. Jacob tried to focus on his chores, but the news lingered in his mind. He could not deny a part of him was curious, and perhaps even hopeful. Maybe, he thought, seeing someone else who had faced challenges might give him a perspective on his own struggles. Weeks passed, and the heat continued. Jacob's situation worsened, debts piled up, and the crops failed completely. Every day felt like a battle to survive. But then one morning, the woman appeared at the ranch. She had come with a simple offer: to help. Jacob was surprised. And for a moment, he was skeptical. Why would someone like her, strong, confident, independent, want to involve herself in his mess of a ranch? But there was sincerity in her eyes, and he sensed a kindred spirit. She did not speak of money or fame. She only wanted to work, to find a place where she could belong and make a difference. Her arrival changed the rhythm of the ranch. With her help, Jacob began to see small improvements. The fences were repaired faster, and the animals were cared for with renewed energy. More importantly, she brought a sense of hope that Jacob had not felt in years. Her presence reminded him of the strength he had within himself, the resilience that had carried his family for generations. And yet, he also felt a strange unease. The world outside the ranch still judged them, and he knew that relying on someone else, no matter how well-intentioned, was not without risk. Despite his worries, Jacob found himself talking to her more openly than he had spoken to anyone in years. He shared the struggles, the fear of losing the land, and the loneliness that had grown like a shadow over his life. She listened patiently, never judging, always offering quiet encouragement. There was a warmth in her voice, a gentle assurance that perhaps not all challenges needed to be faced alone. Slowly, a bond began to form between them, built on trust and mutual understanding. The town, however, did not react kindly to their growing connection. Gossip spread quickly. As it always did, people whispered about Jacob's strange new companion, questioning her motives and his judgment. Some were openly hostile, suggesting he was making a mistake, while others simply watched with curious eyes. But Jacob had grown tired of caring about their opinions. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of determination that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with connection and trust. One evening, as the sun set over the parched land, Jacob stood on the porch of his small farmhouse, watching the horizon glow with shades of orange and pink. She stood beside him, quiet and calm, letting him take in the moment. For a brief time, the weight of debt, failure, and judgment seemed to lift. In the fading light, he realized something important. Survival was not just about keeping the ranch afloat. It was about finding people who could share the burden, who could help restore not only the land, but the spirit. That night, as the stars appeared one by one in the clear sky, Jacob felt something he had not felt in years. A glimmer of hope. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future that was not defined by struggle alone. The woman had come into his life at a moment when everything seemed lost, and in her quiet, steady way, she had reminded him that strength could come in unexpected forms. She was more than a helper. She was a reminder that life, even in its harshest moments, still held the possibility of connection, trust, and renewal. And so, the stage was set. The rancher, desperate and weary, had met someone who would change the course of his life in ways he could not yet understand. The town would continue to watch and judge, but Jacob knew that the real battle was not against the drought, the debt, or the gossip. It was against the fear that had kept him from trusting and opening his heart. With the woman by his side, he felt ready to face whatever came next, knowing that together they could confront the challenges of the land, the town, and the life that awaited them. Little did he know, the bond they were beginning to form would be tested in ways that would challenge everything he thought he knew about trust, responsibility, and the strength of the human spirit. But for now, under the vast sky and the quiet hum of the ranch, there was a moment of peace, a moment where hope, fragile yet resilient, had returned to a man who had long given up on believing that life could offer anything but hardship. After a few weeks of working together, Jacob began to notice subtle changes in the ranch. The fences that once leaned and sagged now stood firm. The animals seemed healthier, and even the small garden, though modest, was beginning to show signs of life. But the most noticeable change was in Jacob himself. He walked taller, felt a little lighter, and smiled more often than he had in years. He had grown used to the woman's presence, her quiet efficiency, and her unshakable calm. Every morning, she arrived at the ranch before sunrise, rolling up her sleeves without complaint, tending to the chores with a strength and dedication that left Jacob both impressed and, strangely, inspired. The woman, whose name was Leora, had an air about her that was impossible to ignore. She was tall, certainly, but her height was accompanied by a grace that made her movements seem effortless. Even when lifting heavy loads or tending to the animals, she moved with care and precision. It was not only her strength that impressed Jacob, but her patience and understanding. She never rushed him, never questioned his decisions, and never let the frustrations of the land or the town get to her. There was a steadiness about her that made the chaos of Jacob's life seem manageable, even predictable. Despite the improvements, life at the ranch remained difficult. The land was dry, the debt still loomed over them, and the town continued to whisper behind their backs. Some neighbors offered small gestures of help, a sack of feed here, a few tools there, but many kept their distance, skeptical of the strange partnership forming at the edge of town. Jacob had grown accustomed to the judgment, but Leora seemed untouched by it. She never commented on the gossip, never reacted to the stares or whispers. Instead, she focused on the work, on making the ranch a place of life and productivity once again. And in that focus, Jacob found comfort. One evening, after a long day under the blazing sun, Jacob sat on the porch with Leora. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers from the nearby hills. The ranch was quiet except for the low hum of cicadas and the occasional moo from the distant cattle. Jacob sighed, feeling the tension of the day leave his shoulders. "I don't know how you do it," he said quietly. "I've been running this ranch all my life, and I can barely keep up. But you make it look easy." Leora looked at him, her expression calm but thoughtful. "It's not about making it easy," she replied. "It's about finding a rhythm, a way to work with what you have instead of fighting it. The land, the animals, even the town, they all have their own patterns. You just need to learn to listen." Jacob nodded slowly, absorbing her words. He had never thought of his work that way before. To him, survival had always been about pushing harder, working longer, and doing whatever was necessary to stay afloat. But now he realized that perhaps he had been approaching life too forcefully. There was value in patience, in observation, in understanding before acting, and in Leora, he saw someone who embodied that principle fully. As days turned into weeks, their bond deepened. It was not a romance at first, at least, not in the traditional sense. There was no grand gesture of love, no whispered declarations under the stars. Instead, there was trust, a quiet, steady trust that grew from shared work, shared meals, and shared struggles. Jacob found himself confiding in Leora more than he had confided in anyone for years. He told her about his fears, the debt, the drought, the creeping sense of failure that seemed to shadow every decision. She listened without judgment, offering advice when asked, but mostly providing a sense of presence that was comforting in its simplicity. For her part, Leora shared pieces of her own story. She spoke of growing up in a harsh environment, of challenges that forced her to rely on her own strength from a young age. She did not dwell on the past, nor did she seek pity, but in sharing, she revealed a vulnerability that made Jacob respect her even more. Here was someone who had faced hardship and come through it with grace. Someone who understood the weight of responsibility and the value of perseverance. The town, however, continued to watch them with suspicion. Rumors began to circulate more openly. Some said Leora was only at the ranch for work. Others suggested she had plans of her own that might not align with Jacob's best interests. But Jacob had learned to tune out the whispers. What mattered was the work, the land, and the growing trust between him and Leora. The town could say what it wanted, but their partnership was real, and the results were visible. The ranch, once failing, was showing signs of life again, and for the first time in years, Jacob allowed himself to believe that survival was possible. One afternoon, a challenge arose that would test their trust and resilience. A sudden storm swept through the area, bringing heavy rain and strong winds. The animals grew anxious, the fences threatened to collapse, and the small garden was at risk of being washed away. Jacob and Leora worked tirelessly side by side, securing the livestock, reinforcing the fences, and protecting the land as best they could. The storm raged for hours, but neither of them faltered. By the time the rain subsided, the ranch had survived largely intact. They were drenched, exhausted, and muddy, but there was a sense of accomplishment that warmed them more than the sun could. It was after that storm, sitting by the small fireplace in the farmhouse with a warm cup of tea, that Leora spoke words that stayed with Jacob. "You don't have to do this alone," she said softly. "You've been carrying everything for so long, but you don't have to." "Not anymore." Awe. Jacob looked at her, feeling the weight of those words settle over him. He had spent years believing that vulnerability was a weakness, that asking for help was a failure. But Leora's words were not about weakness, they were about trust, about partnership, about acknowledging that life was easier when burdens were shared. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future where he was not alone, where the ranch, the town, and his own life could be sustained by collaboration rather than struggle. Days turned into weeks, and their routines solidified. Leora's presence became a pillar of stability. She managed the chores with precision, planned the workdays efficiently, and always found ways to make the most of limited resources. Jacob found himself learning from her methods, adopting new approaches to old problems, and slowly regaining confidence in his ability to run the ranch. But more than that, he learned the value of trust, of allowing someone else to share responsibility without fear of judgment. Despite the progress, the town's scrutiny remained. Children whispered as they passed the ranch. Neighbors cast skeptical glances, and gossip seemed to follow them everywhere. Some of it was harmless curiosity, but some carried a sting of malice. Yet Jacob no longer felt the same anxiety he had before. Leora had helped him build a shield, not one of walls and isolation, but of confidence and clarity. The town could think what it wanted. It did not define their reality. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, casting long shadows across the ranch, Leora and Jacob walked together to check the remaining livestock. The air was cool, the faint scent of rain lingering from earlier showers. They moved side by side, speaking little, comfortable in the silence that had grown between them. There was no rush, no pressing deadlines, only the rhythm of the ranch and the understanding that came from working together. Jacob realized something important as he looked at Leora. She had become more than a helper. She was a partner in every sense of the word, not because of titles or declarations, but because of shared experience, shared struggle, and shared trust. She had brought life back to the ranch, yes, but more importantly, she had brought life back to him. He felt a quiet gratitude, one that did not require words, only acknowledgement and action. As the evening grew darker, they returned to the farmhouse. Jacob sat on the porch, looking out at the land he had once feared was lost. Leora joined him, her presence steady and reassuring. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of calm. The ranch was not perfect, the debts were still pressing, and the town's whispers continued. But for the first time, he felt that he could face it all. Not alone, but together. It was in that moment, under the vast sky dotted with stars, that Jacob understood a simple truth. Life was not meant to be survived alone. It was meant to be shared. With trust, with effort, and with people who were willing to stand by you, even when the world seemed to turn against you. Leora had shown him that, and in return, he vowed to honor that trust, to face every challenge with courage, and to rebuild not just the ranch, but the life he had almost given up on. From that point onward, every task, every challenge, and every small victory was a shared experience. The ranch, once a symbol of isolation and struggle, became a place of partnership, resilience, and hope. And while the road ahead was uncertain, Jacob knew that with Leora by his side, he was no longer facing it alone. The story of survival had transformed into a story of trust, courage, and the quiet power of connection, lessons he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Life at the ranch had begun to change in ways Jacob had never imagined. With Leora's help, the once struggling farm was slowly showing signs of recovery. The animals were healthier, the fields less barren, and even the small vegetable garden was producing modest harvests. Jacob could see that the hard work was paying off, yet he also knew that rebuilding the ranch was only part of the challenge. The real struggle was balancing trust, responsibility, and the judgment of a town that still refused to understand them. Leora had become indispensable. Her presence was constant, her work ethic unmatched. She could lift heavy loads with ease, repair fences in minutes, and calm the anxious livestock with a gentle hand. Jacob, for all his experience and knowledge of the ranch, began to rely on her more than he ever thought he would. Yet with that reliance came new challenges. He realized that trust was not just about depending on someone else to do work, it was about sharing decision-making, sharing responsibility, and sometimes, sharing authority. That realization weighed on him, for he had always been used to being the sole decision-maker. One morning, after a night of heavy rain, Jacob discovered that part of the fence near the northern pasture had been destroyed. Several cows had wandered toward the woods, and a few calves were dangerously close to straying. Panic surged through him as he realized how quickly disaster could strike. Leora, noticing his agitation, placed a calm hand on his shoulder. "We'll handle this together," she said softly, her eyes steady and reassuring. "Panicking won't bring them back, but planning will." They worked side by side, her strength and efficiency complementing Jacob's knowledge of the land. They rounded up the animals, repaired the fence, and ensured that everything was safe. The task was exhausting, but when it was done, Jacob felt a deep sense of relief and gratitude. Leora's presence had prevented what could have been a serious loss. More importantly, it highlighted a truth Jacob could no longer ignore. He could not do this alone, and perhaps he never should have tried. Yet even as the ranch began to stabilize, the town's scrutiny intensified. Some neighbors openly questioned his judgment in trusting Leora, while others whispered that she had ulterior motives. Jacob tried to ignore the gossip, but there were moments when it gnawed at him. The pressure of external judgment, combined with the responsibility of running a recovering ranch, left him mentally and emotionally drained. He began to see the weight of his own choices in a new light, the fine line between survival and control, between trust and dependence. Leora, ever observant, noticed his growing tension. One evening, after a long day of work, she approached him while he was sitting on the porch, staring at the fading horizon. "You're carrying more than you need to," she said gently. "You're worried about the town, the debts, the land, but you're forgetting one thing. You're not alone anymore. You don't have to be." Jacob sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's hard not to think about everything at once," he admitted. "I've always carried it all by myself. Asking for help feels strange, almost wrong." Leora smiled softly. "Asking for help is not weakness. It's strength. It shows that you care enough to make the right choice. Not the easy one. We can handle this together, but you have to let go of the idea that it's all on your shoulders." Her words struck a chord with him. He had spent years believing that independence meant surviving alone, that responsibility was a burden he had to bear without sharing. But in Leora's calm presence, he saw that true strength could come from partnership, trusting someone else to stand beside him, not behind him. Slowly, he began to understand the deeper meaning of her support. It was not about control, but collaboration. As the weeks passed, challenges continued to arise. A particularly harsh windstorm threatened to destroy parts of the barn, and a sudden illness among some of the livestock required urgent care. Each time, Jacob and Leora faced the problem together, blending his experience with her strength and resourcefulness. In these moments, the bond between them deepened. They learned to anticipate each other's actions, to communicate without words, and to trust instinctively. It was a partnership built not on convenience, but on necessity, respect, and shared survival. But the growing closeness also brought its own set of emotional complexities. Jacob found himself noticing Leora in ways he hadn't expected. Her quiet determination, the way she approached challenges with calm focus, and her unwavering support sparked feelings that he struggled to name. He was aware of the social consequences as well. The town had already started whispering about their unusual arrangement, and he worried that any overt signs of closeness could provoke gossip, misunderstanding, or even hostility. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the hills and painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Jacob and Leora sat on the porch. overlooking the fields they had worked so hard to restore. Silence stretched between them, comfortable yet loaded with unspoken thoughts. Jacob finally broke it. "Leora, I don't know how to say this without it sounding strange, but you've changed everything here. Not just the ranch, but me. I don't know how I ever managed without you." Leora's gaze softened, and she reached out to place a reassuring hand on his arm. "You've managed because you had to," she said. "But now, you have someone to share it with. That's all." The conversation lingered in Jacob's mind long after the sun disappeared below the horizon. He realized that their partnership was more than practical. It was emotional, psychological, even spiritual. He had found in Leora not just a helper, but a kindred spirit who understood the weight of life, the burden of responsibility, and the need for trust. And in that realization, he felt a mixture of awe, gratitude, and a little fear. The fear came not from her, but from the possibility of failing her, of breaking the fragile trust they had built together. The town, of course, did not remain silent. Rumors began to spread more aggressively. Some questioned Jacob's judgment, suggesting he relied too heavily on Leora. Others speculated about the nature of their relationship, implying motives that had no basis in reality. Jacob tried to ignore the chatter, focusing on the ranch and the bond he shared with Leora. Yet, the whispers were difficult to escape. They reached his ears through casual conversation, through neighbors' sidelong glances, and even through children passing by who mimicked what they had heard. It was a constant reminder that society's perception was often harsher than reality. One evening, a neighbor approached him directly, speaking in a voice laced with judgment. "Jacob," he said, "I don't know what's going on with you and that woman, but you need to be careful. People talk, and it's not good for the town or the ranch." Jacob took a deep breath. He could feel the old frustration rising, the urge to defend himself and Leora, but he stopped. Instead, he replied calmly, "I appreciate your concern, but we're managing things just fine. The ranch is improving, and that's what matters." The neighbor frowned but said no more, leaving Jacob with a renewed sense of clarity. He realized that he could not control what others thought or said. The only thing he could control was his own actions, his own decisions, and the respect he showed to Leora and the ranch. In the following months, life continued with its mix of hardships and victories. Together, Jacob and Leora faced every challenge. From repairing damaged fences to nursing sick animals back to health, they celebrated small successes, like the first healthy calf born after the storm, or the first modest harvest of vegetables from their garden. Each triumph, though minor, felt monumental because it was achieved together. Through all of it, Jacob learned invaluable lessons about trust, responsibility, and human connection. He discovered that relying on someone else did not diminish his strength, it enhanced it. He understood that true leadership involved collaboration, that respect was earned through actions rather than authority, and that resilience was built not in isolation, but in partnership. By the time the summer faded into autumn, the ranch had transformed. It was still modest, still struggling in some ways, but it had life, purpose, and a sense of stability. Jacob and Leora had forged a partnership that went beyond work. It was built on trust, shared responsibility, and mutual respect. They had faced storms, illness, and judgment together, emerging stronger for it. And yet, Jacob knew that the most important lessons were still ahead. The trust they had built was precious, and it would be tested in ways neither of them could predict. But for the first time, he felt ready. Ready not just to survive, but to embrace life fully, with all its challenges, uncertainties, and rewards. Under the crisp autumn sky, as they walked through the fields inspecting the fences, Jacob felt a quiet sense of pride. The ranch, once a symbol of struggle and despair, had become a place of growth and hope, and in Leora, he had found a partner who was steady, reliable, and unwavering, a reminder that life's burdens were lighter when shared, and that true strength came not from doing everything alone, but from trusting someone else to stand by your side. Autumn had fully settled over the ranch, bringing cooler winds and golden light across the fields. Jacob stood on the porch of his farmhouse, watching the leaves drift gently from the trees and settle on the earth below. The ranch, once dry and lifeless, now carried a quiet energy. The fences were sturdy, the animals healthy, and even the small vegetable garden had provided a steady yield. But it wasn't just the land that had changed, it was Jacob himself. He felt lighter, more capable, and strangely content in a way he hadn't in years. Leora stood beside him, quietly observing the horizon. She had worked tirelessly, as always, yet there was a softness to her posture that Jacob had come to recognize as satisfaction, a deep contentment that came from seeing hard work bear fruit. For her, the ranch was no longer just a place to belong, it was a symbol of shared effort, trust, and resilience. And for Jacob, her presence was a constant reminder that life was not meant to be carried alone. The town's whispers had not disappeared entirely. Some people still questioned their partnership, while others still gossiped about the unusual arrangement. But Jacob no longer felt the anxiety he once had. The judgment of others no longer dictated his sense of worth or success. He had learned that what mattered most was the bond he shared with Leora, the stability they had built together, and the life they were slowly reclaiming from hardship. One morning, a new challenge arose. A neighboring ranch was facing a shortage of feed due to the harsh summer, and the animals were at risk of starvation. Jacob knew that helping them could stretch their limited resources, yet he also understood the importance of community. He looked at Leora, silently asking for her thoughts. She considered it carefully, then nodded. "We can manage it," she said. "Sharing doesn't weaken us. It strengthens trust both here and with others." Together, they organized a plan. They divided their stock feed, coordinated with neighbors, and ensured that no animal went hungry. The effort was exhausting, yet fulfilling. The grateful smiles of those they helped reminded Jacob of something he had long forgotten: the power of kindness and generosity. It was a lesson not just about survival, but about the ripple effects of doing good even when life felt hard. As the weeks passed, Jacob and Leora continued to face both small and large obstacles. The weather grew colder, and with it came new challenges for the animals and the land. They worked tirelessly to ensure warmth for the livestock, to store enough food for the winter, and to maintain the fences against heavy winds. Through it all, their bond deepened. They had learned to communicate almost without words, anticipating each other's needs and decisions. The partnership that had begun as practicality had blossomed into something much more profound: mutual respect, trust, and an unspoken understanding that together they could endure anything. Jacob often reflected on how far he had come. He remembered the desperate days when he thought he might lose everything: the land, the animals, even his sense of purpose. At those times, he had felt isolated, crushed under the weight of responsibility, and overwhelmed by fear. Now, looking at the ranch and at Leora, he realized that he had not only survived, but had grown stronger, because he had learned to trust, to share, and to accept help without shame. The lessons were hard, but they were invaluable. One evening, after the animals had been fed and the work was done, Jacob and Leora sat together on the porch. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth. Silence stretched comfortably between them, a contrast to the chaos they had once known. Jacob took a deep breath and spoke softly. "Leora, I don't think I've ever told you how much this has all meant to me. Not just the help with the ranch, but everything. Your presence, your trust, it's changed me." Leora looked at him with calm eyes, her hand resting gently on his. "You've changed too," she said. "You've learned that trust isn't weakness, that asking for help isn't failure. You've grown stronger because you allowed yourself to grow, not just as a rancher, but as a person." Her words settled over him like the first gentle snow of winter. Jacob realized that this was more than gratitude. It was a recognition of the transformation they had achieved together. They had faced storms, hardship, and doubt, And yet they had emerged resilient. The ranch had flourished, yes, but their personal growth, their trust, and their partnership were the true victories. The town, slowly, began to notice. The gossip persisted, but so did the results. People saw the ranch thriving, the animals healthy, and the small successes accumulating. Some of the skeptical neighbors began to offer small gestures of respect, acknowledging the hard work and the visible proof of dedication. While Jacob and Leora didn't seek approval, it was satisfying to see their efforts recognized, even if quietly. The world outside the ranch had not changed entirely, but they had changed their own place in it. Winter arrived with its challenges. Snow covered the fields, and bitter winds swept through the valley. The animals required extra care, and the work that had once been exhausting now felt almost relentless, yet Jacob and Leora faced it together. They took shifts tending to the livestock, repairing the barn against snow damage, and ensuring that the ranch remained functional. Through the harshest days, their partnership was tested, but it endured. They had learned that true strength lay in collaboration, not in solitary struggle. Amid the work, Jacob began to see the deeper meaning of what they had built together. The ranch was more than a plot of land. It was a symbol of resilience, of trust, and of hope. Every repaired fence, every healthy animal, and every successful harvest was a testament to their effort, patience, and dedication. They had taken what was once a place of despair and transformed it into a haven of life and stability. And in the process, they had transformed themselves. One evening, as the snow fell gently over the hills, Jacob reflected on their journey. He remembered the early days of desperation, the endless worries, and the crushing weight of failure. He remembered the first day Leora had arrived, offering help quietly, without fanfare. And he remembered the small moments that had built their trust, working side by side, sharing meals, facing storms together, and learning to rely on each other without fear. Those moments, he realized, had been the true foundation of everything they had accomplished. Leora joined him on the porch, wrapping a warm blanket around both of them. The snow sparkled under the moonlight, and the ranch lay peaceful and still. Jacob felt a sense of contentment that was both profound and rare. "We've come a long way," he said quietly. Leora nodded, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the moon. "We have. And we'll keep moving forward. Together." Jacob smiled, feeling the weight of the past years lift. The ranch was no longer a symbol of struggle, but a place of possibility. The town's whispers no longer mattered. What mattered was trust, partnership, and the quiet power of shared effort. He realized that life's true victories were not measured by wealth, land, or public approval, but by resilience, connection, and the ability to stand together through challenges. The days that followed were filled with both work and quiet moments of reflection. Jacob and Leora continued their routine, tending to the ranch, caring for the animals, and preparing for the future. They celebrated small successes, like the first snowfall that stayed gently on the ground without damaging the barn, and the first harvest of winter vegetables. Each victory, no matter how minor, was a reminder of how far they had come. By the time the first signs of spring appeared, the ranch had fully transformed. The animals were thriving, the fields were recovering, and the small garden was producing new life. The partnership between Jacob and Leora had deepened beyond words. They had faced storms, illness, doubt, and hardship, and yet they had emerged stronger, wiser, and more resilient. Jacob often thought back to the day Leora had arrived at the ranch. At the time, he had been desperate, lonely, and uncertain about the future. He had not known that a single person could change everything, not just the land, but his outlook on life, his sense of purpose, and his understanding of trust. Now, he understood that life's challenges were never meant to be faced alone, and that true strength came from sharing burdens, trusting wisely, and building bonds that endure. Under the clear spring sky, Jacob and Leora walked through the fields together, checking on the animals and planning for the coming season. The air was fresh, filled with the promise of growth and renewal. The ranch, once a place of struggle and despair, had become a testament to resilience, trust, and the quiet strength of human connection. And in each other, they had found not just a partner, but a source of courage, inspiration, and hope that would carry them through any challenge the future might hold. As they stood together, looking out over the land they had nurtured back to life, Jacob realized something profound. Life's greatest victories were not in wealth, recognition, or even survival. They were in the bonds we build, the trust we honor, and the courage to face the world together. And with Leora by his side, he knew they could face anything. The ranch was no longer just a farm, it was a symbol of hope, of growth, and of a future that they would create together, step by step, day by day. In that quiet moment, Jacob understood that their story was not just about the survival of a ranch, but the survival of the human spirit. It was about learning to trust, to give, and to receive support without fear. It was about facing adversity with courage, patience, and unwavering dedication. And above all, it was about finding strength in connection, realizing that life, when shared, is far richer, far fuller, and far more meaningful than life faced alone.